Now, today we are inhabiting an epoch which is quite remarkable, because within the sphere of science there are no longer any secrets. The methodology of science necessitates that all of its practitioners remain in communication with each other, and therefore that every scientist, as soon as they have made a breakthrough or conceived of a novel concept, they hasten to publish. It's essential for them to do this because some other scientist somewhere else in the world might be contemplating matters along the very same lines and would be stimulated in his efforts by this man's speculations, even if not by discoveries. Consequently, the entire scientific world endeavors to maintain communication, and for this precise reason it became absolutely infeasible to keep atomic energy a secret. In earlier eras, that might have been achievable, because there were numerous secrets once upon a time, and individuals were not granted access to these secrets unless they were in some manner vetted and deemed capable of managing them without becoming dangerous. We exist in such a perilous era because all the secrets are accessible to everyone, and anyone can become dangerous with them. And that is precisely the scenario we must confront, and that is precisely the predicament we have to manage. It is too late to halt it, because that would be, as the saying goes, locking the door after the horse has bolted. The vice president of an exceptionally significant corporation in the United States, very forward-thinking and very essential, a few months ago stated, there are two primary forces operating in the world today, for good or for ill. One is Red China, the other is LSD, music. And there exists a certain justification why such a substance as a specific chemical, which is capable of expanding people's consciousness in a particular fashion, should be something immensely troubling, because this specific chemical, in conjunction with a multitude of others that have been known for centuries but have been rather kept inconspicuous throughout those centuries, is capable of achieving something which simply cannot be permitted. That is to say, capable of initiating suitably prepared individuals or occasionally inadequately prepared individuals in on a secret which is exceedingly closely guarded and which is, as a matter of fact, the deepest and most fundamental of all our societal taboos. I have recently concluded authoring a book which, with a certain tongue-in-cheek demeanor, I had the nerve to title the book, and it is subtitled, you see, The Taboo Against Knowing Who You Are, because that is truly the element that must not be revealed. Ask yourself this: for what reason would a person be judged completely insane? What kind of assertions must an individual simply not make? Well, there is one, and that is if anyone asserts that he is God. That simply is not permissible, certainly not in our culture, although it is quite common in India. But in our culture, that is simply not tolerated, because we are mostly from a Christian heritage, and if not that, from a Jewish background. And there is a great deal in common, because both Christians and Jews are deeply preoccupied about someone named Jesus Christ. Both Christians and Jews are, in a manner of speaking, followers of Jesus Christ in distinct ways. He is a dilemma for both, because he was the man who emerged and realized he was God, and that simply is unacceptable. The Jews addressed it one way, the Christians addressed it quite as effectively in another way. The Christians handled Jesus perfectly, even more deftly than the Jews, by placing him on a high status and claiming this was the only man who ever was God, and nobody else was truly so before, and certainly nobody can be so afterward. Stop right there, put him on the altar, bow down to him, worship him, so that everything he had to convey will be rendered null and void. Applause, and it functioned magnificently. But you see, the problem with profound secrets is that they cannot be suppressed indefinitely. As a certain president of the United States famously once remarked, you can fool some of the people some of the time, but you cannot fool all of the people all of the time. And we human beings have been systematically duped by ourselves. It is not as if there was some covert, sinister conspiracy with someone else to blame for a considerable number of centuries, into the belief that we are strangers in the universe, that the world that resides beyond the boundary of our skins is not us, and is some quite foreign mechanical device into which we arrived and from which we will vanish, and we truly have nothing very much to do with it. It's something about which we can adopt an objective stance. We can observe it, we can quantify it, we can calculate it, but it all turns out in the end to be some sort of dull, stupid mechanism in which we're involved, because as bodies, we are part of it. But it is standard thinking for most individuals that they themselves aren't even their bodies. They are detached specters which possess bodies, like people possess cars, and in which they travel around and encounter the external world as if it was something in which you were confined. And children can protest to their parents, I didn't request to be born just because of your peculiar romantic entanglements and all that. I got entangled in this world, and you are responsible. And we do not even consider that we had anything personally to do with the fact that our fathers once had a mischievous sparkle in their eyes. But that mischievous sparkle was you arriving. Music only, you see. By this conception of our own identity that we maintain, we are enabled to shirk responsibility for all manner of circumstances and declare, no, it was my parents. See, if a person is caught in juvenile delinquency and he understands a little Freud, he can assert, well, I couldn't help it because I was psychoanalytically mishandled when I was an infant. Even before perhaps I was born, my mother had all sorts of complications. And then if he avoids the consequences with that, the journalists say, for juvenile delinquents, the children should not be penalized, but the parents. And the parents respond, hey, wait a minute, we were mishandled by our parents, and we admit we're pretty poor parents, we concede. But our parents before us raised us in a certain manner that we are hopelessly neurotic, and we can't truly raise children. But we have to. So everyone could shift the blame all the way down the sequence. The woman that thou gavest me, she tempted me, and I did eat. And then when God pointed his finger at the serpent didn't reply anything because the serpent knew the answers. He knew the truth which must not be acknowledged, that the left hand accompanies the right hand, that black accompanies white, and that you wouldn't comprehend what white was unless you comprehended what black was, and that, you wouldn't comprehend what is was unless you comprehended what isn't is, and you wouldn't know what here is unless you knew what there is, and you wouldn't comprehend what was meant by myself unless you comprehended what was meant by other. And that is so elementary, but everyone endeavors to disregard it. Now, here is the dilemma. You see that there are certain procedures, some of which are what you might term spiritual exercises, others are merely chemicals, others are just basic common sense, whereby one comes to perceive very clearly indeed that black accompanies white and self accompanies other. And as this becomes manifest to you, it's rather unsettling because, look, if what you define as you is inseparable from everything which you define as not you, just as front is inseparable from back, then you realize that deep down between self and other there is some kind of collusion. If these things always manifest in combination and appear very distinct from each other and feel quite distinct, nevertheless the sensation of difference between them permits each one to exist. And so underneath the opposition or the polarity between self and other, or between any other pair of opposites you can conceive of, there is something shared, as there is, for example, between figure and background. You cannot perceive a figure without a background. You cannot have an organism without an environment. Equally, you cannot have a background without a figure, or an environment without organisms in it, or without things in it. You cannot have space which is devoid of any solid. You cannot have solids not occupying some space. This is absolutely rudimentary, and yet we do not realize it because, for example, the typical person believes that space is nothing, that it is just a sort of not there-ness in which there are things. We are somewhat apprehensive that not there-ness, that nothingness, that darkness, that the negative poles of all these oppositions will prevail, that they will ultimately engulf every form of existence and every form of darkness. But when you grasp the nature of the situation, you realize that that will not occur because what is referred to as not existing is completely incapable of being there without the contrast of something referred to as existing. It is like the crest and the trough of a wave. You cannot have a wave that is entirely trough and no crest, just as you cannot have a wave which is entirely crest and no trough. Such a phenomenon has never been observed in the physical universe. They coexist, and that is the secret. There truly is no other secret than that. But it is thoroughly suppressed, and consequently, we are all conditioned to feel that we have to contend for the white because the black might triumph. We've got to survive. You must survive. That's the paramount necessity we're all operating under and experiencing it day after day in apprehension. Because this is a definition of anxiety. Anxiety is the apprehension that one of a pair of opposites might annihilate the other permanently. And if by any possibility, by any method, you discover that that is not the case, you have an entirely novel perspective on what human beings are undertaking, which may be very creative, but which also may be very perilous. You see through the game called white must win, because you know that neither black nor white are going to win, because they belong to each other. So one of the difficulties of the various chemicals which can alter the human mind in specific ways, so that it becomes evident that inside and outside belong together, is that they do rather reveal the trick, and people who consume these chemicals and perceive through the human game cannot be trusted. They may choose to be good sports and re-enter the game and participate in it as if it were authentic, or they may not. And if they do not, then what's going to transpire? Wowee, that's pretty grave. Now you see what is. Let me speak explicitly for a moment. I mentioned the subject of this is LSD. LSD is one such chemical that does generate this strange effect of making you cognizant of the polarity of things. It performs many other functions. It performs many rather unassuming, trifling functions. And these, of course, in all the media coverage in the various national magazines about LSD are thoroughly highlighted. In other words, when someone says something is truly psychedelic, they mean bizarre. And when the national magazines attempt to illustrate the consequence of these chemicals with various photographs, they appear with blurred photographs of all kinds of objects, randomly jumbled together, nude women viewed through prisms, and people posing like this. No, in Life magazine, they had a complete sequence of photographs of people like this. You turn over a few pages, and here were the wives of the astronauts in front of the television when their spouses were out there in space. They became like this too. You couldn't discern any distinction if you didn't read the headlines. Well, that's absolutely unconnected to the matter. If you desired some sort of suitable illustration for a Life magazine article on the effects of LSD, you would have one very straightforward solution. You would publish the most magnificent color reproductions of Persian miniatures and of Moorish arabesques and of the illuminations of Celtic manuscripts. That would provide you with the narrative so far as transformations in human sensation are concerned. But there would be one element very challenging to convey in pictures, because the people who looked at them, if they didn't grasp the perspective, wouldn't see it. And that is what I will term the sensation, as well as the intellectual comprehension of polarity. That is to say that the inside and the outside, the subjective and the objective, the self and the other, belong together. In other words, there is a harmony, an unbreakable harmony. And when I'm employing the term harmony, I don't necessarily imply something sweet. I mean absolute concordant relationship between what occurs inside your skin and what occurs outside your skin. It is not that what occurs outside is so forceful that it shoves around and dominates what occurs inside. Equally so, it is not that what occurs inside is so powerful that it frequently succeeds in manipulating what occurs outside. It is very simply that the two processes, the two behaviors, are one. What you do is what the universe does, and what the universe does is also what you do. Not you, in the sense of your superficial ego, which is a very small, little, tiny area of your conscious sensitivity, but you in the sense of your total psychophysical organism, conscious as well as unconscious. This is not something that emerged in the world from somewhere else entirely, that confronts an alien reality. What you are is the universe, in fact, the works, what there is and always has been and always will be, forever and ever, performing an action called a jolly good show. And this is such a subversion of common sense, but it is, as a matter of fact, something, if you pause to contemplate it, that is completely evident. only everything conspires to prevent you from seeing that obvious fact, because when you were babies, practically all your parents and your teachers and your aunts and uncles and your older brothers and sisters collaborated, and they informed you who you were. They defined you as Johnny, who is just Johnny. And now, don't you come on too strong, Johnny, because you've got elders and betters around here. But you're responsible. You're a free agent. You'd better be. And so when you are informed from childhood that you are expected and commanded to behave in a manner that will be acceptable only if you do it voluntarily, you remain permanently confused that if anything is permanent, is brain damage. So, but that's the concept, you see, because that's the game we are playing. You started it, I didn't. See, that's the game we're playing, and we can construct all kinds of complexities out of that, and truly, in a way, have enormous enjoyment. But once anyone sees through that, well, we are frightened. Once you acquire this sense of polarity, of your inside being the same process as your outside, and your ego being one and the same process as the entire universe continuing, then we are apprehensive that people may say, well, good equals bad, and we can do anything we like, and we needn't in any way be further subject to the ordinary rules of human conduct, and we can wear what clothing we like, or no clothing at all. We can have what sex life we like. We can do anything, and we are going to generally, because the world is being rather oppressive toward us, challenge the whole system and become dangerous. And a lot of people are doing just precisely that. So I want to introduce into this whole problem an ancient wisdom. I have really two elements to discuss. How cultures which always did know in some way, or among whom a large number of people always did know this secret, managed it, and then I want to present some observations about how we are attempting to manage it and how it is not going to succeed. Among the Hindus and among the Buddhists, this perspective of the true identity of a human being has always been known, at least by a very influential minority. The central doctrine of the Hindu way of life, I call it that, rather than a religion, is in Sanskrit. Tattvamasi, you're it. To put it in a kind of informal way, you're it. And it is the that than which there is no that, which they call the Brahman, or the Atman with a capital A, meaning the self. You're only just pretending that you're just poor little me. See, the function of a guru, that is to say, a spiritual mentor in India, is to give you a funny look in the eye, because you come to him and say, Mr. Guru, I have difficulties. I suffer, and it's chaos, and I can't control my mind, and I'm miserable and depressed, and so on. And he gives you a funny look, and you feel a bit uneasy about the way he looks at you, because you think, he is reading your thoughts, and this man is a great sage. He can read everything that's in you. He knows right down into your unconscious, and you know all the dreadful things you've contemplated and all the terrible desires you harbor, and you are rather ashamed that this man looks right through you and perceives them all. That's not what he's observing. He's giving you a funny look for quite another reason entirely, because he sees in you the Brahman, the Godhead, just claiming it's poor little me, and he's going to eventually, by all sorts of subtle methods that are termed in Sanskrit upaya, that in politics means cunning, and in spiritual education means skillful pedagogy, he is going to try and trick you back into realizing who you genuinely are. Because that's why he gives you a funny look, and why he seems to see right through you, as if to say, Shiva, oh boy, don't deceive me. I know who you are, but you're playing the part beautifully in this performance that you're someone else entirely. And I congratulate you. You're doing a wonderful job playing this role, which you call the person, my person. A person is a facade. The word means a mask. So if you read books on how to be a real person, you're reading books on how to be a genuine fake. The word persona, as you know, means a mask worn in Greek or Roman drama. So if you arrive to the guru and say, well, he asks you who you are, Sri Ramana Maharshi, when anyone approached him and they asked him, as people do, who was I in my last incarnation? Or will I be reincarnated again? he always responded, "Who's asking the question?" And everyone was annoyed because he wouldn't provide them with answers about what they were in their former lives. He said, "Who are you?" And he looked at you. "Have you observed photographs of this man? I keep a photograph of him, close by, because of the humor in his eyes. They are observing you with a dancing sparkle, saying, 'Come off it.' Now then, in these Asiatic traditions, it is well understood that people who gain the realization that you're it may very well become dangerous. And therefore, they always pair any method of acquiring this, whether it is yoga, whether it is smoking something, or drinking something, or whatever is the technique, they always pair it with a discipline. Now, I know the term discipline isn't very popular these days, and I would like to have a different term for it, because most people who teach disciplines don't teach them very effectively. They teach it with a kind of harshness, as if a discipline was something that is going to be extremely unpleasant, and then you're going to have to endure it. But that's not the genuine secret of discipline. I would prefer to employ the term skill. Discipline is a method of expression. Say you want to convey your feelings in stone. Now, stone doesn't yield very easily. It's tough material, and so you must acquire the skill or the discipline of the sculptor in order to express yourself in stone. So, in every other way, whatever you engage in, you necessitate a skill. And it is enormously important, especially for American people, to comprehend that there is absolutely no possibility of experiencing any enjoyment in life at all without skill. Money doesn't purchase enjoyment, ever. Look, if you want to get completely intoxicated and go out and acquire a bottle of bourbon and down it, you cannot do that except for people who have practiced the distiller's art. You cannot even make love without art. Where I reside in Sausalito, we have a harbor full of ever so many pleasure craft, motor cruisers, sailing boats, all kinds of vessels, and they never depart the dock. All that transpires with them is their owners host cocktail parties there on Saturdays and Sundays, because they discovered, having purchased these things, that the discipline of sailing is difficult to learn and demands a lot of time, and they didn't have time for it. So they just bought the object as a status symbol. So, in other words, you cannot have enjoyment in life without skill, but it is not an unpleasant task to learn a skill if the teacher in the first place gets you captivated with it. There is immense enjoyment in learning how to do anything skillfully, to construct carpentry objects, to cook, to write, to calculate anything you desire. It can be immensely pleasurable to learn the discipline, and it is completely indispensable. Because, look, you may be a very inspired musician. I am not a musical technologist, you see, and I regret it. But I'm a word technologist. But I can hear in my head all kinds of symphonies and all kinds of marvelous compositions. But I do not possess the technique to write them down on paper and share them with someone else. Too bad. Maybe next time around. But you see, so far as words are concerned, I can express ideas because I have studied language and I've worked very diligently. Not that I didn't appreciate it. I intensely relish the work of writing a book, although it is difficult. But it's fascinating to utter what can never possibly be uttered. So would you see what's happening? What you have to accomplish, you have inspiration, but then you must have technique to incarnate, to express your inspiration. That is to say, to bring heaven down to earth and to express heaven in terms of earth. Of course, they are truly one behind the scenes, but there is no way of demonstrating it unless you perform something skillful. You see, we are all at the moment absolutely in the midst of the beatific vision. We are all one with the divine, or I don't like that sort of vague language, but we are all there. But we are so much there that we are like fish in water. They don't know they're in water, like the birds don't know they're in the air, because it's all around them. And in the same way, we don't know what the color of our eyes is. I don't mean whether you've got blue or brown eyes, but the color of the lens of your eye. You call that transparent. No color, see? Because you can't see it, but it's fundamental to being able to perceive anything. So, in order to find out where you are, there has to be some method of drawing attention to it. And that involves skill, upaya in Sanskrit, skillful means. So it's all very well. Anyone can experience ecstasy. Anyone, as a matter of fact, can become aware that he is one with the eternal ground of the universe. But since that is what you are anyway, I'm going to inquire, so what? When a hero embarks on an adventure and he departs his people and is journeying to a strange land, he could go away and just hide himself around the corner in an obscure house and then reappear a year later and declare, I've been on a heroic journey, and tell all sorts of tales. And they say, prove it, because they anticipate him to bring back something which nobody has witnessed before. Then they believe you've been on the journey. So in the same manner exactly, anyone who embarks on a spiritual journey must bring something back. Because if you just say, oh, man, it was a gas, anyone can state that. Now, this is why in the doctrines of Buddhism there is a distinction between two kinds of enlightened beings. They are both forms of Buddha, which is to say the word Buddha means somebody who has awakened, who has discovered the secret behind all this. And in other words, all this thing we call life, with its frantic preoccupations, is a big performance which you, in your unconscious depth, are deliberately establishing. So you can do one of two things when you discover this. You can become what's called a pratyeka Buddha, that means a private Buddha who doesn't disclose anything, or you can become a bodhisattva. Pratyeka Buddha goes off into his ecstasy and never is seen again. Bodhisattva is someone who comes back and appears in the everyday world and participates in the game of the everyday world by the rules of the everyday world. But he brings with him upaya. He brings with him some method of showing that he's been on the journey, that he's returned, and he's going to let you in on the secret too. If you will play it cool and also return to join in the everyday life of everyday people. Because this is the rule. If the world is theatrical, if the world, as the Hindus say, is a big act put on by the divine self, one of the rules of entering on stage is that you don't enter as yourself, you enter as the part that you're going to perform. It's very poor form if an actor always acts the same way. That's what's termed a star, as distinct from an actor. A real actor can become anything. And so, but in private life, well, he's just Mr. Jones, but he doesn't enter the stage that way. So, in the same manner, if you know that behind the scenes, in the depths, fundamentally, you are it, you don't enter that way. It always enters as something else. That's the rule of the stage. Because without that, there wouldn't be a play. It would only be reality, no illusion. And the entire purpose of life is illusion, from the Latin word ludere, to play. Showbiz, the show must go on, so don't give it away. But the truth has a tendency of leaking. It gets out. But then the crucial thing is, you see, when the truth gets out, those who grasp it must find a method of remaining in contact with what society calls reality. That is to say, if you have a radio, you don't only need an antenna, you also need a ground. So what transpires in the realm of mysticism, of a psychedelic visions, and so on, needs to be grounded. So then there are always two trajectories in which such a discipline functions. One, preparatory. In other words, those who taught disciplines for awakening in the Orient were always careful to screen, first of all, to screen those who applied, and then after screening them, to make them sensible, so that they knew how to manage the game and of ordinary human existence and play it by the ordinary human rules. In other words, that they had strength of character and were not the kind of people who would be destroyed because they had no strength of character by an overwhelming experience. Then they let them in, but there are certain disciplines, such as Zen, where you get into the central secret very early on in the discipline, and after that they're concerned with much more training in showing you how to utilize it, how to use the power, to use the vision which you have acquired. And so it is with the current, what we will call LSD scene that is raging through the United States. It unfortunately lacks discipline, and I'm not attempting to express this in a kind of severe, authoritarian, paternalistic manner, but only that it would be so much more enjoyable if it had it. In other words, when people attempt to express what they have witnessed in this kind of altered state of consciousness, they exhibit 5 movies playing concurrently, projected upon torn bed sheets, with stroboscopic lights flashing as quickly as possible at the same time, and 11 jazz bands playing, and they're going to blow their minds. Baby, whenever everybody else who hasn't experienced this phenomenon looks around and says, well, it's a mess. I don't like the appearance of it. Let's assume that while you were very, very high on LSD, you looked into a filthy ashtray and you saw the beatific vision, which is, of course, the case. Because wherever you look, if your eyes are open, you will see the face of the divine. Then you emerge from your ecstasy with the dirty ashtray and declare to everybody, here it is, music. No, there is a possibility. If you are an extraordinarily skilled painter or even photographer, of presenting the dirty ashtray so that everybody else will see almost what you saw in it. But you will have to possess a technique which will transform every grain of ash into a jewel, because that's what you actually saw. But that requires mastery of an art, and I'm afraid people believe that all it's necessary to do is just toss out any old thing, because under that transformed state of consciousness, any old thing is the works, but nobody else can see it if they haven't shared that perspective. So then this becomes for us in the United States an extremely significant social problem. The cat is out of the bag. We are living in a scientific world where secrets cannot be preserved, and anyone, anytime, can pick up something which will short-circuit all the ancient religious techniques. Yoga practice, meditation, etc. Service is all very awkward, but it will happen not for everybody, but for a lot of people. And they will see what all those sages and Buddhas and yogis and prophets saw in ancient times, and it will be very clear. So what? So you see, you can say, look at all these people who haven't seen it. This is a temptation. Look at them all going about their business, earning money, and struggling at the bank or the insurance office or whatever it is every day, and how serious they look all about it. And they don't really know it's a game. And you can cultivate a certain disdain for people like that. But it's very, very wrong to do that because, of course, don't forget, they have a certain disdain for you. You see, always the respectable people in town who live in the best residences, they know that they are respectable because there are some people on the other side of the tracks who are not respectable. And so at their cocktail parties, they have a lot to talk about concerning the people who are not respectable, because that boosts their collective ego. There would be no other method of achieving it. You don't know that you're a law-abiding citizen unless there are some people who aren't. And if it's important to you to congratulate yourself on being law-abiding, you therefore have to have some criminal classes outside the sphere, of course, of your immediate associates. On the other hand, the people who are not respectable, they have their parties, and they boost their collective ego by saying that they're the people who are truly in. Whereas these poor squares who delivered the mail faithfully and who carry on what you call responsible jobs, they're just deluded. Or when they earn their money, all they do is purchase toy rocket ships with it and go roaring around and so on, and they think that's pleasure. So the people who are not respectable boost their collective ego in that way, neither of them realizing that they need the other just as much as a flower needs a bee and a bee needs a flower. So when you see the people who you think are not in on the secret, if you genuinely understand, you have to revise your opinion completely and say that the squares are the people who are really far out because they don't even know where they began, see? An enlightened Hindu or Buddhist looks at the ignorant people of this world and says, my respects, because here I see the divine essence having altogether forgotten what it is and playing the most far out game of being completely lost. Congratulations, how far out? Music. So if you understand that, you don't start a war with people you might call squares. Don't challenge them, don't bug them, don't frighten them. The reason is not because they are immature, because they are babies, and you mustn't scare babies. This has nothing to do with that. You mustn't frighten them because they are performing a very far out act. They're walking on a tightrope, miles up, and they've got to perform that balancing act. And if you shout, they may lose their nerve. See? That's what we call the responsible people of the world are doing. It is an act, it's a game, just like the tightrope walker, but it's a risky one, and you can get ulcers from it and all sorts of difficulties, but you must respect it and say, congratulations on being so far out. Far out, far out.